I'm very pleased to welcome Emma Frost, Director of Innovation, Sustainability and Community at London Legacy Development Corporation. Hi, Emma.
Hi there.
There are lots of things I would like to ask you in relation to our theme this month, which is active cities. But first, could you tell me a bit about your role at LLDC?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Director of Innovation, Sustainability and Community at the London Legacy Development Corporation. We are the not-for-profit organisation that's responsible for the management of the Olympic Park and the long-term delivery of the legacy missions from 2012 around the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And my role specifically is quite a broad remit, as the title suggests, but it is that for a very important reason, because all too often the different disciplines of innovation, environmental sustainability and community are thought of as separate and discrete entities. And actually, the most interesting area of inclusive innovation are the things that can really blend and bind community involvement and civic participation with environmental sustainability focused innovation. And that's principally what we're most interested and excited about on the park in terms of our innovation strategy.
Brilliant. And it feels very appropriate to be talking about the Olympic Park for our active theme, given its roots in sports. But since 2012, the park has really established itself as a test bed for some really exciting examples of future active travel. Could you tell me a bit more about the trials and the pilots that you've been running?
Yeah, of course. So the park is, we're blessed with a 560-acre site, and it's all singularly managed and in public ownership, as I said before. So that creates an ideal kind of condition for a playground, really, for trialing a lot of different embryonic or slightly more evolved innovation tests and experiments. And active travel and travel in general, or mobility in general, has been a key kind of pillar of our innovation thinking. So an example of some of the work that we've been doing, for example, one of the first ones we did was the Navia driverless bus trial in 2017. And that was a program trialing fully autonomous vehicles in a real world setting. So there'd been lots of trials done before in kind of closed loop, almost like lab environments or on a racetrack somewhere, but nothing in a real world setting. And that's a really important distinction, that sort of leap into practical testing in that real world, real living environment is quite a fundamental point within the innovation cycle. And so the work that we did with the Navia buses was really interesting because, in all honesty, it was less about trialing the tech. That was a critical element of it, but most of that tech had been road tested quite robustly before it got to the Olympic Park. It was more about understanding people's perceptions to the driverless buses and understanding the behavioural change and the reactions to it. So really trying to get that engagement with residents and to see how people react to the idea of a driverless vehicle and what their questions are and what their kind of attitude is towards it. So often a lot of the innovation trials that we've been doing, obviously the tech is fundamental, but it's often not the main thing that we're interested in exploring by the time it gets to the real world testbed at the Olympic Park. Often that is much more about the interplay between the tech and how it gets applied and interpreted and reacted to by the different users and different use cases. So another good example would be the Capri trial that we did in 2018 and 2019 and again in 2020. So this was a project, a pilot project, which included the design, the development and the testing of connected autonomous pods. And it was culminated in on-road public trials, both on the Olympic Park and in Bristol. And again, this was all about how you deploy the technology in real-time environments and with real people. So we were keen to involve local communities in these trials. We had school children coming to test out the pods, being inside it, walking alongside it, walking in front of it, and inspire them about the kind of innovation activity that's happening on their doorstep and finding out more about not just the engineering, but also the technology that's powering that, and then also the kind of the practice of how do you do that process of innovating and refining and critical thinking and then application. And it was phenomenal to see how people interact with these different pilot projects. Another example that I could cite was we were the first area in the UK to trial e-scooters. So back in 2018, we did a pilot with bird scooters. This was before e-scooters were commonplace, I should say, around our kind of streets and roads. Obviously, they're still not legal. And again, us being a singularly private managed estate, we were able to designate certain routes where the e-scooters could be used safely and appropriately to test out functionality of them, how they dealt with things like drop curbs, what the speeds were and how they interplayed on shared use with alongside cyclists and walkers. So it was really important to get a lot of this testing done, and actually all the findings from our work back in 2018 were fed into the DFT to help fast track some of the e-scooter trials that they've now started to roll out elsewhere, and into the new legislation consideration that they came out with during the lockdown and COVID, actually, as people started to use scooters more and more. So really trying to help inform where it might go, because as I mentioned before, e-scooters are still not legalized on the roads, but there are a number of different private hire trials that are popping up. So the work that we did with Bird back in 2018 helped inform the development of all of those trials and the consideration for changes to legislation that's enabled them. And we've got loads more examples, particularly on the active travel side, but maybe I could chat about them in a bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's so interesting hearing about how you can enable that feedback loop in the testing process, and then use that intel to share with others who are doing similar initiatives in London or other cities.
But that's so important, because it's that network of different players in the innovation system, and then the sharing of findings and learnings, good and bad, that means that we can fast track a lot of the testing of new solutions, whether they're tech-based or whether they're process-based. You know, it's about having that rigorous critical analysis and iterative design process, but then sharing the lessons and the learning in a very open way that allows us to, as I say, fast track some of the solution building that we really need to respond to, whether it's the environmental crisis or the changing nature of how people are moving around and living in cities. There's a lot of emphasis at the moment on needing to think and operate differently to be able to respond to big global challenges. And unless we've got the right support structures around our kind of innovation networks and the discipline that we can apply to that, we won't make fast enough progress.
You mentioned Bristol. Are there other UK cities and London boroughs that you're working with?
Yeah, there are lots. So I'm also chair of the UK Innovations District Group, which is a network of 10 other kind of core regions up and down the UK that label themselves as innovation districts and innovation centres. And we have a really good sort of peer-to-peer, we're a kind of community of practice. And that's a network of practitioners that want to share and work together and want to cross-pollinate ideas and opportunities for different innovation activity. There aren't as many urban innovation centres that have the sort of testbed offer that we have at the park. And that's a combination of the physical setup of the park, as I mentioned before, you know, the fact that it is managed as a single great estate, the fact that we have an amazing array of different types of users coming to the park on a daily basis. We're framed by residents who live there. We've got the railway interconnection, we've got the waterways interconnection, we've got the cycle paths, the footpaths, you know, we've got Westfield on our doorstep. So it's quite an incredible physical platform, but we've also got the economic assets with the schools and the different with the different academic partners like UCL, London College of Fashion, Loughborough in London, and a whole host of others. So it's a real kind of perfect combination of those economic assets as well as the huge kind of SME and micro business market that we've got on and around the park. And then we've got all those social network assets, as I mentioned before, that interface with citizens directly and with other third sector organisations and citizens groups and the local authorities. So having that interplay between the physical, economic and social assets is absolutely key. And citing all of that in an area like the Olympic Park in the middle of East London is quite a unique proposition that allows us to confidently say we're one of the most complex and compelling urban testbeds in the UK. There are others in the UK and globally, but not that many, and certainly not all with the composition of different factors that we're lucky enough to have.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant, and clearly you've got lots of initiatives for bringing both local residents, but also local skills and entrepreneurial expertise into the work that you're doing. I've heard you reference growing an inclusive innovation district. Is that Is that really what this is all about? And what role do you think that will play in the future of the area more broadly?
That's exactly what this is all about. So a lot of the innovation activity in the innovation economy thus far tends to be thought of in the realms of prop tech, fintech, or often health tech. And actually, there's so much more scope. Those areas are amazing kind of fields of innovation, but there is much more scope for us to think more broadly about what innovation models and innovation sort of pathways and systems can unlock in other sectors and between sectors. So it's that blending between different sectors where you often do find the ripest moments for innovation, and also broadening who gets to innovate and on what agenda and with what return, with what benefit. And that's where we start to think about the realm of inclusive innovation and really focusing in on what do we mean by inclusive growth and what levers and programs do we have that return more shared value, whether that's different skills development pipelines, not just new jobs, but different types of jobs, different pathways into those jobs, different training programs so that we can localize the kind of the supply chain and also the kind of the labour forecast of what's coming through to serve those emerging industries and new sectors. But also thinking very much about what we term inclusive innovation, which is really trying to understand the purpose-led and purpose-driven innovation. Who gets to set those problem statements? Who's involved in citing what it would be useful to innovate around? And how often are local residents or general civic participation, there's a barrier to that. So what happens if you start to engage communities at the very beginning and you involve them in that problem statement setting exercise, and you understand from a local perspective what are the challenges they are facing on a daily basis, and how could you try and create innovation models that respond directly to that? So there's all sorts of different things, whether it's on the social or economic side, whether it's on the sort of civic involvement in the innovation process, or whether it's on innovating specifically for shared global challenges like environmental measures and trying to do climate adaptation to the 1.5 degree rise, all of which we're looking at because we have such a keen and clear focus on inclusive innovation rather than innovation for innovation's sake.
So interesting. And as you say, a growth market, lots more to look forward to in the future. What do you think, what does the future look like in this area? And how do you think some of the things that you've been testing in the park will influence the way we get around London in the future?
Well, right now we're at quite a critical junction, aren't we? Because the last 18 months have meant that we're having to rethink how we live in cities, how we work in cities, how we travel through cities, how we consume in them, the leisure time that we spend in them and the leisure activities. Our city models have been disrupted like they haven't been for many, many decades. And so that creates a fundamental kind of pause and reflection moment, which is actually really opportune for a lot of the innovation work. And I think the park itself plays a vital role in that, because as I mentioned before, we're the ideal place to test and trial a lot of these different initiatives and hopefully grow them into viable solutions. But there's a stage before the solution and rollout and scale up where you've got to test things, you've got to test them in real time, and you've got to test them with real people in real environments. And that's what the park Inclusive Innovation District offer puts on a plate like nowhere else. And I think it's really important that we're able to do that across all different scales. So if we think about the big picture in terms of the future of mobility, there are huge opportunities that we're exploring on the park, from electric vehicle charging points at scale, and thinking about the future of mobility hubs and what integrated mobility service might look like if you're charging EV buses alongside fleets, so taxis and Uber cars, and if you're charging bikes and scooters, e-scooters at the same time. Like, what does an integrated mobility hub look like there, and how could you deliver that within a residential, densely residential area, right through to the hydrogen hub and the amazing centre that's coming as part of UCL East on the Olympic Park, as part of the East Bank development. There will be a hydrogen hub there. So what does that mean in terms of translational research into the future of maybe hydrogen powered buses, and could we start to pilot some of that on the park, and what's the sort of what's the timeline for developing those sorts of innovation projects? Because obviously they are quite big in scale and they take a lot of planning and setup, but it is all possible. And then you get right back down to the micro scale, the sorts of things that I was just talking about with the active travel examples. They are no less important than the big mega scale, because the future of mobility is going to be about a blended offer. And it's going to be about how we understand all different scales and types of mobility and movement, and how we think more about mobility as a service. And with that always comes a mix of the big picture to the small picture. And we've been doing a lot of work thinking, as you mentioned before, about what the future of decarbonised or zero carbon local travel systems looks like. And active travel is a big piece of that jigsaw. There are other pieces as well, but we've started the research to understand what the baseline is around the park and how we can benefit from the fact that the park is essentially a perfect 15-minute city model. So what does that open up in terms of opportunities for us to think about zero transport at the localised level? And there'll be a whole number of different projects and trials that spin off the back of that research work, because what we've wanted to do is do the research and set the right baseline in terms of data and analysis, so that we can then dive into much more developed trials and solution building projects. So another example of that actually is an innovation trial that we've just kicked off in the last 2 weeks, working with an organisation called FEMA. And they are actually an AI platform specialist that help work with CCTV cameras to train the AI platform to be able to detect different modes of transport to a degree that's not been done before. So we want to be able to train the difference between someone walking and running. We want to be able to train wheelchairs versus pushchairs. We want to be able to train white vans versus tractors, and to detect all of that so that we can get real-time data on how people are moving across the park and where there are near misses at junctions, and how often, what the normal speeds are. All this different intelligence that helps us build a much clearer picture of what types of movement are happening in and around what parts of the park. And once you've got that richness of intel, you can then start to think in a much more fine-tuned way about the different tests and experiments that you want to run to be able to develop new solutions. And so we're just at the stage where we're gathering our kind of evidence base, if you like, whether it's through detailed research work on net zero carbon at the localized scale and what we can do specifically in the park on that, or whether it's through gathering our kind of baseline real-time data on how people are currently moving across the park and using what modes. And then from that, we're going to be developing a whole series of different mobility-focused trials that are all speaking to decarbonised and inclusive, so accessible modes of transport.
So much to digest there, Emma. So many interesting things happening at the park, and lots of insights there that tie into the theme that we'll be exploring in September at the London Real Estate Forum, Resilient Cities, both on the social, environmental and economic side of things. So I look forward to discussing this further at the event.
Brilliant. Thanks. It's really nice to talk to you.